I next want to call your attention to the often gender-neutral or gender-blind terminology that hides the asymmetrical relationships between men and women. So during the first day when we were having that meeting on violence against women, I was struck by the multitude of terms that were circulating. And what struck me about many of those terms was how gender-neutral, gender-blind, power-evasive, benevolent, too euphemistic they were. They were power-evasive. So one of my first things that I would like to recommend is that we speak about things as they are, that we name things as they are. So terms like domestic violence, or what I also heard a lot, family violence, violence in intimate partner relationships, we should avoid them. It protects the perpetrators of violence while leaving the victims unprotected. Early on, feminist criminologists pointed out how misleading and affirmative of existing power relationships such terms are. It suggests that both men and women can equally become the victim of violence, with the other gender as likely to be the perpetrator. In reality, however, in the Netherlands, it is in 90% of the cases that it is men who use violence against women. We can just say that we are, in general, when we are talking about gender and sexually related violence, it is men who are acting out against women, children, and gays and lesbians. But it also bears pointing out that the term domestic violence in itself, or family violence, they hide gender power relations by the way it is expressed in many languages. So in many languages it is said, I was raped, obfuscating the perpetrator, saying in fact, it doesn't really matter who did this, I didn't see that or whatever, instead of he raped me. This is also one of the things we need to start to say. And what is also another corollary of this obfuscating and power evasive, gender evasive way of speaking is that it often leads to lack of concrete government policies to counter the phenomenon of men perpetrating violence against women, which is also, unfortunately, the case in the Netherlands nowadays. Despite repeated pressure by NGOs and the women's movement, the government has not drafted a national action plan to eradicate gendered violence. But let me first sum up this first point about gender, which already shades into its intersection with race ethnicity, by foregrounding three conclusions which certainly are true for the Netherlands, but may also have resonance in Estonia. First, gendered violence and sexual abuse are all too often seen as natural phenomena, as if they were part of nature. There's nothing can be done about them. Secondly, there is a power-evasive way to treat these phenomena, which is evident in the terminology, family, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and it's also power-evasive in the way it is talked about in many languages, in the sense of I was raped versus he raped me, which obfuscates the gender of the person who's the perpetrator. Following from that, we also see lack of concrete policies. Thirdly, the third conclusion is that all too easily, the dominant representation of gendered violence and sexual abuse is that it is predominantly located in the working class and in ethnic minority groups, not in dominant white society. With this move, several things are accomplished, but importantly, the dominant group flatters itself by placing the problem outside of itself, proclaiming itself as civilized, while constructing working class culture and ethnic minority groups as barbaric and uncivilized, not capable of being an integral part of an emancipated society. I'm now moving on to race, ethnicity, and to a lesser extent, I will deal with class. I see another remarkable phenomenon in the Netherlands. Earlier in the year, in March 2010, the Dutch media reported about a domestic drama in Zierikzee, which is another kind of lost village in the province of Zeeland. Pretty soon afterwards, the language changed, and now one could read, Iraqi father murders his 2 children. And it was marked as an honor killing, the heavily loaded term that is reserved for violence in Islamic circles. Thus, a pattern is visible in which the perpetrator and his nationality or ethnic background are mentioned when it concerns men from ethnic minority groups, not when the perpetrator is a member of the dominant white population group. This is in keeping with another feature of the dominant discourse, which I just described, in which we ascribe all kinds of self-flattering characteristics and qualifications to ourselves. That is, that gendered violence is minimal, and that ethnic minority groups are frozen in everything that is ugly, backwards, and barbaric. So there is Eurocentrism and racism evident in this move. And when we cast our lens in a wider frame, we see that something else is happening, that, namely that white women have accomplished their emancipation, that is the thinking, and that they do not suffer from gendered violence anymore, while it is black migrant and refugee women who still are the objects of this type of violence. Thus, people of color are problematized both as perpetrators and as victims in this discourse. For Estonia, I think it might also be worthwhile to reflect on whether a similar tendency is operative. That is the tendency to ascribe innocence to the own group and class, while it is the uncivilized other, whoever that is in any local particular situation, at whose uncivilized and barbaric doorstep the practice is laid down. I'm going to skip a part due to reasons of time, because I do want to end with a poem, and I would be very sorry if I didn't have the time to do that. So I'm going to skip about going deeper into how this came about, that the idea took hold that the emancipation of white women is accomplished. This was put forward by the Minister of Emancipation Affairs in 2003, and since that time we see that it has gained wide purchase. It is part of the dominant discourse that white women are emancipated, even though there are many, many signs that this is not the case, and an opposition has been created with migrant and black women who are called allochthonous women in the Netherlands, those who have come from elsewhere, which basically is a racist term. They need to be emancipated. One consequence of this statement of Minister de Geus has been that it has become possible to do huge cutbacks in subsidized women's emancipation policy, since they were emancipated anyway. So we see that a lot of knowledge that had been gathered by the feminist movement as regards sexual violence against women has been lost, is not transmitted anymore to different generations and to men and women. I'd like to briefly call your attention to the notion of the cultural archive by Edward Said. And he means by it a historically informed structure of knowledge and feelings with respect to racial, ethnic, national others, and also with respect to the self. And he is in fact asking us to contemplate, that is how I read him, what does it mean when the Netherlands, which has had a colonial empire for over 400 years, what does that mean for current racial and ethnic relations? And I'm reading the Krachenburg case, the case of the 5 African women, as being triggered. I'm asking, what triggered the white Dutch perpetrators to treat the African women in such a subhuman fashion? So I'm not necessarily referring to only a conscious pattern of thought and feeling, but also to unconscious patterns, which as Freud would maintain, right, would exercise most influence. Thus, I'm again coming back to the importance of finding out what the Estonian cultural archive would consist of, who's the self, who's the other, and how should the other be treated when we want to know more about root causes. Okay, I am then winding down towards the poem that I would like to read to you, which is a poem by a late African-American poet, Audre Lorde, and she is addressing the seriousness of the silences that are either enforced on women or embraced by women. And in either case, this is not serving us. A litany for survival. For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone. For those of us who cannot indulge the passing dreams of choice, who love in doorways coming and going, in the hours between dawns, looking inward and outward, at once before and after, seeking a now that can breed futures like bread in our children's mouth, so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. For those of us who were imprinted with fear, like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk, for by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy-footed hope to silence us. For all of us, this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it's better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive.
Thank you, Gloria.